Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are really excited today. We get to explore this really unique stack of sources you've provided for us. You've given us two distinct areas to delve into. Both look equally compelling, honestly, and we're ready to unpack them.
Yeah, it's always interesting to see the sheer breadth of curiosity that you bring to these sessions, extracting those key insights from what might seem like, quite disparate information. That's really what we aim to do.
Definitely.
And today's topics really promise a deep look into some pretty significant shifts, both globally and nationally.
Okay, let's jump right in then. We're starting with a really striking statement from one of your sources. It says, for the first time in history, Central Asia just pivoted away from the West and toward Beijing.
Wow.
That's quite a declaration, isn't it? It almost sounds like the moment the global balance of power starts to, really shift.
It really does. And what's particularly revealing, I think, is the way China is framing this shift. The sources talk about something called the China Central Asia spirit.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's described as much more than just a treaty. It's presented as a kind of new diplomatic mindset. Seems to have really emerged after that Sheen summit back in 2023.
Right.
And at its core, this spirit pushes values like mutual respect, non-interference, that's a big one, and this concept they call shared development.
Shared development.
Exactly. And this approach, focusing on sovereignty and development, it seems to really resonate in a region with its own complex history and needs. It might give China, a unique long-term edge over maybe more traditional Western ways of engaging.
So if it's more a mindset than just a formal piece of paper, it feels like it must connect to something bigger, right?
Yeah.
Your sources actually ask, is this the soft reboot of China's global economic engine? How does this new development plug into the wider Belt and Road Initiative? Is it about smoothing out trade, infrastructure? And it mentions Kazakhstan specifically. Why is Kazakhstan so important here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. This new spirit definitely aligns with, and you could say, breathes new life into the Belt and Road Initiative. Kazakhstan, well, it becomes absolutely critical.
Why is that?
Because of its geography, really, its strategic position. It acts as this essential land bridge, creating a direct pathway for rail, for road networks connecting China straight to European markets.
Oh, okay.
So it just facilitates a much smoother flow of goods, boosts connectivity. It makes Kazakhstan a really key transit hub for what China wants to achieve.
Okay, so beyond the big picture strategy, the geopolitics, what's really interesting is how this China Central Asia spirit actually, shows up on the ground.
Yeah.
How it affects people's lives through these cooperation centers you mentioned were in the sources.
Precisely. And that's important, right? It's not just high-level talk. It has tangible impacts, or at least that's the goal. The sources highlight 3 specific centers.
Like what?
Well, for instance, there's a poverty reduction center. It's explicitly designed to help rural communities directly. We also see an education exchange program mentioned. That means opening doors for students, giving them access to, say, better tech, scholarships, that sort of thing.
And the third one?
And importantly, there's a desertification control center that tackles critical climate change issues, especially in these very dry land regions. So these are pretty concrete, practical initiatives aimed at improving daily life.
It's striking, though, because this feels like more than just economics. It sounds like a significant strategic move, too. The source sort of contrasts it. While NATO holds summits in the West, China is holding these, power talks in the East. What does that mean strategically? Is it a counter to, say, NATO or EU policies in that region?
Well, if you look at the broader geopolitical picture, China's actions here could certainly be read as a strategic countermove, a counter to traditional NATO, EU, and general Western policies in Central Asia.
Yeah.
While Western nations often focus on security alliances or perhaps pushing specific governance reforms, China's putting the emphasis squarely on economic development, non-interference, this shared future idea. And that can be, extremely appealing to countries in that region.
Right.
And interestingly, the sources point out that the Western response has been quiet, or maybe just not there in a big way. It suggests perhaps the West doesn't have a clear sort of coherent strategy for this right now.
Which brings us to this really thought-provoking tension in your sources. They present 2 very different ways to look at all this. Some are calling it peaceful growth, benevolent leadership trying to lift the region up. But others suggest it's more like China quietly building an empire, like a kind of soft imperialism extending its power. That's a huge difference in interpretation, isn't it?
It absolutely is, and it raises that fundamental question. How do we interpret these moves? Is it genuinely benevolent leadership aiming for shared development?
Yeah.
Or is it maybe a more subtle strategic expansion of China's influence and power?
Yeah.
And we should be really clear here. We're simply reporting these different viewpoints as they appear in the material you gave us. We're not, endorsing one side or the other. Our goal is just to give you that full spectrum, let you mull it over.
Okay, understood. So let's shift gears now. We're going to transition to a completely different area from your sources, but one that's just as important, moving from Central Asia to tax reform debates in Australia.
Right. And this really shows the impressive range of things you're curious about. It's actually a perfect example of what we try to do here, help you gain knowledge quickly, thoroughly, even across fields that seem totally unrelated at first glance. You start to see connections.
Exactly. So turning to Australia, your sources pick up on comments from an independent MP, Allegra Spender. She apparently said it's a really positive sign that the Treasurer has recognized the importance of tax reform.
Mm-hmm.
And it notes she's been pushing for this for a while, advocated for it during the last parliamentary term.
Yes, and what's particularly insightful from Spender's comments, according to the source, is her explanation of why it's so hard to achieve what they call revenue neutrality.
Revenue neutrality, meaning the changes don't actually increase or decrease the total tax taken.
Exactly. She points to several kind of structural things in the current tax system that make this difficult. For example, the fuel excise revenue is dropping. People using more efficient cars, EVs.
Oh, yeah, makes sense.
Tobacco excise, too, that's falling as smoking rates thankfully decline. The goods and services tax, the GST, it's actually shrinking as a proportion of the whole tax pie. And maybe most significantly, Australia has fewer working-age people relative to the total population now. That directly hits the tax base. So it highlights this real bind for policymakers, How do you fix these revenue gaps when the usual sources are drying up?
And that leads to the big political challenge, doesn't it? How do you actually persuade voters to get on board with potentially major tax changes, especially if it might hit their wallets?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Spender, who represents the Wentworth electorate, apparently offered a really interesting take on this.
What does she say?
She suggested that getting voters to support tax reform isn't really about dusty economic reports. It's about connecting it to something people in her community really care about, something that motivates them deeply.
Which is?
She observed that people really worry their kids and grandkids are not going to be able to meet the same milestones as previous generations, and that is really motivating.
So linking it to future generations.
Exactly. It suggests that framing tax reform around long-term fairness, intergenerational equity, ensuring future opportunities for families, that could be the key to winning public support, tapping into that deeper sort of societal concern.
Wow, okay. That's certainly a lot to chew on, isn't it? We've covered quite the ground, from China's big strategic pivot in Central Asia, looking at what it means on the ground, all the way to the really detailed discussion about tax reform challenges in Australia.
It really shows how understanding these different shifts, these national debates, even if they don't seem immediately linked, is just vital. Vital for being well-informed about global dynamics and critical national policies. It's all part of seeing the bigger picture, the threads connecting our complex world.
So as you go about your day, maybe keep mulling over those big open questions from the China sources that we started with. Will this alliance change global trade forever? Is Central Asia becoming China's new playground?
Provocative questions indeed.
Thank you so much for sharing your sources with us and for joining us on this deep dive today.